Good afternoon. I'm Justin Gregory. I'm a senior engineer with Jones Edmonds and Associates, and today I've got Gavin Lewis with Fathom joining me.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Justin said, I'm Gavin Lewis. I'm the head of engineering at Fathom here in the UK, and it's a real pleasure to be working with Jones Edmonds and presenting today some really interesting findings on flood modelling.
Okay, so today we feel pretty strongly that it's important that communities moving forward have a good understanding of their flood vulnerabilities, especially in light of climate change and ever-changing flood risk. Today we're going to be talking about how this climate change is affecting flood risk. Looking at Florida as a good example of flood vulnerability assessments with regard to climate change are currently being conducted, showing you two traditional approaches to you, and then excitedly sharing a new alternative approach, which we're very interested in and think is going to be kind of a game changer and make this a lot more of an efficient, timely process. So Hurricane Ian last year was a stark reminder of just how powerful these storms some of these flooding storms can be. Unfortunately, we saw 156 deaths associated with the storm, and 12 of those were attributed directly to inland flooding. More than $112 billion in damages was reported from the storm, and that makes it the third most expensive storm in US history. When looking at rainfall totals across the state, we saw anywhere from 10 to 20 inches of rain, with a maximum of 27 inches recorded near where it made landfall. And many of the communities we work with on a daily basis are still trying to address the issues created by this flooding. Now, we know that climate change is impacting these storms. An interesting study recently showed that Hurricane Ian itself had up to 18% more rainfall on average. Extreme rainfall was associated with the storm because of climate change. So when they ran models of that storm pre-climate, without climate change, they found a significantly less rainfall occurred. This aligns with a lot of other research that's happening at the moment, and it gives us a lot of confidence in these effects of climate change on model results, on the results of our flooding. Now, these trends also are supported by observational data. So we need to start planning for and addressing these changes in flood risk. And we think a great example of this is the Resilient Florida program. It was established 2 years ago by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. And its goal is to coordinate an approach to coastal and inland resilience across the state. The program includes a planning grants component, which generates more than 20 million, which provides more than $20 million a year in funding to communities, cities, and counties across the state to help them plan for flood resilience and specifically conducting flood vulnerability assessments. They also, one of the carrots that the state provides to complete these projects is more than $100 million a year in co-funding for implementation projects, helping to improve the resilience of the state, and that these projects do require that communities have completed the vulnerability assessments laid out by the state. So there was a presentation on this at last year's conference, on this program at last year's conference. Just a quick summary of it. The program requires the use of the latest LiDAR that was flown in 2019, requires that communities on the coast assume sea level rise, has specific sea level rise assumptions. It also requires both coastal and inland flooding be evaluated by communities that complete these vulnerability analyses. We were required to look at vulnerability of critical assets, which the state provides a long list of definition of critical assets that need to be evaluated, and just to identify how they are impacted by flooding. We're looking at 3 time frames in these studies, so that is current, 2040, and 2070 conditions. And it's important, the requirement is that the entire community is evaluated, so we can't just focus on a portion of a city or county. It really has to be countywide or citywide. Generally, the schedule that we're seeing for these projects is in the 2 to 3 year range, and funding for most of our clients has been in about $200,000 to $500,000. But obviously, some communities, larger communities, have got significantly more than this. I know our clients, the cities and counties we're working with, have found some challenges when working on these projects. One is the limited existing flood models. Most of the state of Florida is not covered in a flood model, and where there are, a lot of those models are outdated and just really difficult to apply to this kind of climate change scenario. We have we also have fairly significant budget and time constraints. So generally, I'd say about half of those project budgets is dedicated to the flood modeling, and then there's a lot of other aspects of these vulnerability assessments that need to be included within the budget. Now, the state does provide some guidance and standards, but it's also fairly flexible. So a lot of cities and counties are having to make a lot of decisions about how best to conduct these vulnerability analyses projects to meet the state requirements. Now, today I'm going to show you two examples of different vulnerability analyses that we are working on across the state. And one is St. Johns County on the northeastern seaboard, and then the other is Alachua County, which is an inland community. So St. Johns County includes St. Augustine, and Alachua County includes the city of Gainesville. So for St. Johns County, when we started looking at developing these future flood scenarios, what we started with is their existing 1D RCPR4 countywide model. Covers more than 800 square miles, consists of more than 10,000 1D nodes and 24,000 links. So a fairly detailed RCPR model that has been developed over the last 10 years. And we have a lot of confidence in it, used by FEMA for floodplain mapping, being used to support review new developments across and conduct multiple flood assessments across the county. So generally a model we have a lot of confidence in and a good starting point for this type of analysis. However, what we found is when we start increasing the rainfall based on the rainfall change factors that are being published at the moment, we see that some of the model assumptions start to break down, especially where the 1D links have been played. So we have a lot of glass walls start being generated. And we really have to spend significant time updating that 1D model. So adding thousands of new links, updating the model to account for the new LiDAR, expanding channel cross sections to account for, to handle those additional flows. And then once we just finished running those models, I'm now working on remapping those flood extents. So once again, a fairly significant effort to take that model and use it countywide to evaluate those future flood scenarios, which are well out beyond the limits of what we typically are modeling under current conditions. Alachua County is another inland, as I said, the other inland community we are working with at the moment. In Alachua County, what we found is that there's very limited flood models. So FEMA has conducted some recent flood modeling, but most of the county is not covered by a FEMA model, and that the FEMA maps really don't reflect what has been observed in recent flooding. There's a wide range of flood types within the county, from closed depressional flooding to high relief areas, some lakes, and so pretty large extents with a lot of variation in terrain and a fairly challenging area to model. And the county does not have an existing countywide flood model, such as St. Johns County. So in working with the county, we decided on developing a brand new countywide model that would be based on the 2019 LiDAR, which was released actually late last year. The county wanted to include as much of this GIS of their stormwater infrastructure as possible. So that was more than 14,000 structures. We ended up choosing a new kind of massively parallel modeling platform, 2D modeling platform to support this. And we've done this for other communities in the state over the last 4 or 5 years and find it to be pretty effective. This model runs at pretty high resolution. So, and we did vary that resolution across the county. So some of rural parts of the county were at 80 foot, going all the way down to 20 foot in some of the very urban portions of the cities. We did a quick model verification of this and validation, and we're pretty comfortable in the results. You can see some pretty good calibration there. Didn't actually have much time to do calibration, but the model still was able to be verified against gauge data and more than 80 high water marks recorded during recent storm events, and gave us a mean absolute error of a little over a foot. So pretty comfortable in the result. But once again, it took a fair amount of effort and time to actually complete this analysis. So at the start of these projects, we had asked ourselves the question, well, is there another flood risk mapping data source that we could use to support this? It's important that it met the planning level accuracy requirements we had for this project, needed to provide in the entire community coverage, needed to be able to project out to 2040 and 2070, which is a requirement of this program, and also met the pretty tight schedule requirements. And at the time of that, we'd started talking to Fathom just before that, and really impressed with what they were doing at the time at the time that the map data that they had, flood risk data they had, didn't quite meet these requirements. But I think we're really excited that some of what they're about to release later next month is definitely going to check all these boxes, and it's going to be a great tool. So I'm excited to have Gavin now introduce Fathom and talk a little bit more about what they are working on.
Great, thank you, Justin. So I'd like to give you a bit of an overview of who we are and what we do. So we build computational flood models from big data. And we build those models to be effectively broad-scale 2D flood models and maps for the US and globally. We cover all the main subperils of pluvial, fluvial, and coastal flooding, and we have those as separate layers. We provide the depths and extents of those flood risks at multiple return periods. But by building those data sets from big data, we have, essentially can provide that broad scale contextual mapping at a continental scale. So that's really important for us for the work that we do, and really can help show the context for the work that Justin's just alluded to. But one of the important things around our data is that we set up from the Bristol University Flood Research Group, and scientific research really underpins everything we do. And we're very proud to publish our methodologies and the validation of our models and maps and data sets in the leading scientific journals. And we make all those papers, those peer-reviewed scientific papers, available on our website. And I would encourage you to go to our website and have a look at those papers and read those papers, because we're very transparent about our methodologies. And this really gives confidence to our partners like Justin and team, and also our end users, that actually there is a valid scientific basis for our modeling, and it's defensible, and it builds confidence across all the stakeholders. So one of those papers that we have built and done is a comparison between our data and FEMA data. And this was published a little while ago on our 30-meter data set for the US, where we compared the data to FEMA data. And we would say that our data really complements FEMA data. We're not looking to replace it at all. FEMA is essentially the gold standard, and we fit in our data around that. But our data really very accurately represented the FEMA areas for flooding within error of the FEMA data set. So we're very confident that we can replicate the data sets that FEMA produce within our data set. However, there are other areas that we can really add value. And you can see here there's some additional work we did where we're comparing our data to FEMA data. We capture all river channels. We cover both pluvial and fluvial and coastal flooding. So we're able to give that very broad scale, extremely consistent view of flooding, both at a local level, at a city level, at a county or state level, but also countrywide, which is really important for the projects that you're working on. But it's not just the current view. We are building our new data set for the US, and it will be including future climate scenarios. So why does that make a difference? Well, here's a great example in Houston, where we're looking at coastal flooding today, but also for 2050. So we're able to give that future perspective around the impacts of climate change on flooding across the whole country. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about our new US data. We have two varieties of data. We have the flood maps with our depths and extents flooding for the different subperils of fluvial, both defended and undefended, and the coastal, again, defended and undefended views, as well as the pluvial data. We have 8 return periods, and we provide that data in GeoTIFF format. In addition to that, for some of the work that you may be doing where you're looking at understanding assets and the implications of flood risk across a series of point locations or assets, we have risk scores that are basically combined from our flood maps, but give a slightly different output. And they're really valuable when you're doing that high-level screening and understanding of those implications. So that's for a current view of flooding under the current climate scenarios. One of the important things is really, what does that future view look like? So we're able to give for a range of time horizons between 2011 and 2100 against a whole range of different climate scenarios, as you can see here. So through the science that we're applying here, we're able to give a really good understanding of the impact of climate change and flooding and across a number of different scenarios. And we're very clear here, there's of course uncertainties in the models. And what we're providing is not just the 50th percentile, but also the 17th to the 83rd percentile, which the IPCC recommend as IPCC, recommend as the acceptable band of analysis. So we have a broad range of data sets there. But I guess really, you'll probably understand or wanting to know, well, how does this fit in? How does this really benefit me on the work that projects that you may be doing? So I want to give you this as an example that project we did last year for the Texas Water Development Board. Following Hurricane Harvey, their state legislature produced a report that really assessed the impact of the hurricane, but also looked at how they could future-proof that against the state against future similar events. So part of that report assessment realised that there was to do anything sensible across the whole state, they needed really good data, because a lot of the state was not covered by flood modelling. They broke that down into a number of specific areas or regions for regional flood planning processes to engage locally with the stakeholders who have the knowledge on the ground. And so through that analysis, 63% of the state was unmapped. So to do that very detailed local analysis, the Texas Water Development Board needed a consistent view of flooding across the whole state. As you can see from this image, they had a variety of different data sets that were very good in areas, and they essentially had this, what they call a patchwork quilt of data. And so they needed one single view to bring all that together. And that's where Fathom came in to produce our data set. So we ingested the recently captured LiDAR for the whole state. We cleaned that up and built a new terrain data set for the state. We ingested that into our modeling framework, and we were able then to produce both pluvial, fluvial, and coastal data sets for the board. And we were able to deliver that in less than 6 months for the whole state. And that was not only the hazard data sets for the return periods that were required, but also the new terrain data set. And you can see this image here where we had the existing floodplain quilt, the existing data that the state the Texas Water Development Board had, but also then overlaying the areas that were filled in by the consistent Fathom data. That data is now being used by the regional flood planning groups. And for a number of those groups, I was lucky enough to meet some of those representatives earlier this year in Austin. And they were really pleased about the quality and the validity of the data, because they'd never had anything like this before to really understand the impact of flooding in their local communities. So it's a real benefit for not only at a whole state level, but very much at a local and community level, which is really important on these types of projects. So I wanted to introduce you to another case study. This is in East Africa, where we're bringing in a number of variables. This is Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and we're overlaying the impact of not only climate change, but urbanization, and how the risk of flooding can be mitigated by nature-based solutions. So we can see here in this image where the levels of urbanization have been overlaid on a future climate projection for 2050. And this is a 1 in 20 year event. So a relatively high frequency event, relatively low impact, but we can see here a number of areas that are impacted by flooding. So what we can do now is, by the introduction of nature-based solutions, we can see that a number of these areas have been reduced in the impact of flooding. And if we bring that together in a single view, what we're able to do is identify the areas that benefit from the impact of nature-based solutions, both today, but also under a number of different variables, being the climate change and urbanization, which is really important when you've got cities like this that are growing very quickly and are naturally going to be impacted by the changes in climate. So this is where we're bringing a number of variables together and remodeling it within our modeling framework. And it's providing a great benefit to those organizations. So this type of modeling is really going to be applicable to some of the areas that we see that are going to be impacted by flooding and climate change in the future. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of some of the work that Fathom do. And then Justin is now going to be able to put that into context for you on the work that he's been doing.
Thank you, Gavin. So we've been Fathom has been kind enough to share some of their data with us for evaluation. And I should say this is their older data, so not the latest data, which will be coming out next month. And we've been very impressed with it. This is a quick screen capture just showing what we've compared to that detailed modeling in St. Johns County that I shared earlier. We've been very impressed with this statistics. Generally, most of the differences we've seen are actually more of a result of differences in the scale between the 1D model and with the Fathom's 2D model being modeled at a higher scale, but perhaps deleting some of they've screened out some of the smaller flooding that they've included. So once you add that back in, we actually get a very good match. Potential for some calibration and improvements, yes, but definitely a very good representation of flooding. So when we looked at that mean absolute error, we were at just over 1.5 feet. So well within the types of range we're looking at for this type of study. We did also look at Alachua County and generally provide a reasonable representation of the flooding. But what we found there is on the older data set, Fathom was using the national elevation data set, and that really just doesn't characterize the topography within Alachua County that well. And we know that their latest model is going to include the latest Florida LiDAR, so that will give us a much better representation of flooding. So finally, we are really excited about the use of Fathom. We have a number of these vulnerability assessments lined up, and we are excited that this product is really going to allow us to improve the schedule of those projects, helping our clients to get onto that list to be eligible for the capital improvement plan projects funding a lot sooner. It's going to meet that planning level of accuracy requirement. More importantly, it does provide both pluvial, fluvial, and coastal flooding, as Gavin had mentioned. So far, we just focused on mainly that pluvial flooding, but just the incorporation of those other flood risk products is going to be extremely helpful for a number of our clients. And as Gavin had mentioned, they run the range of storms that we need as far as required in Florida. It's also important to note it's scalable, so that this data is available for a city, a county, a region, or an entire state could purchase this data pretty easily and cost effectively. And then it also provides a consistent approach. So one of the challenges we see at Florida at the moment is that you have different communities adjacent to each other making different assumptions on modeling approaches and what to represent in these models. And so when the public looks at the results, they're seeing very different results, which can be a challenge to communicate and kind of undermine the process a little. So thank you for your time, and now we open up for questions.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm sharing.